And now let's welcome Doug Adler. He was a longtime tennis commentator for ESPN, was quite well known, had a great career going. And then he became one of the first cancel culture targets, I use that word instead of victims, of the Trump era. One day before Trump was inaugurated as president, which also happens to be Doug Adler's birthday, he was fired by ESPN. No questions asked, no interviews, no negotiations. What sin must this commentator have committed? He used the word guerrilla as in guerrilla warfare, and it was misinterpreted by one person as gorilla. And he was talking about the style of play, rushing the net, by Venus Williams, who happens to be Black. The one person, unfortunately, happened to be a rather inexperienced intern for the New York Times, who then decided to run with it. Oh my God, he used the word gorilla. Now let's remember, Trump has just become president. He's about to. He's a racist. There's media everywhere ready to overreact. And so what we see and what happened to Doug Adler of ESPN in January of 2017, it is the start in some ways of a lot of the cancel culture stuff, of the Trump racism stuff. It went out of control. And for something that never should have been a story at all, had the reporter merely waited, asked the commentator, hey, what'd you mean? And then did something later. So for that long intro, my apologies, folks, but let's hear from Doug Adler, because actually the guy has survived near-death experience. I mean, he had a heart attack a month later, but he's still out there pitching, man. And he's actually got a book he wants to work on about it, because he wants to say something broader about cancel culture in America. So let's give him the chance to do it here. Hi, Doug, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Appreciate the introduction. And, everything that you're talking about and everything that I feel is based on just a couple of things. Number one, awareness. People being aware rather than hateful or angry or spiteful. It's more about just a general awareness. And with that awareness comes education, and comes, as like the reporter that called me a racist, essentially, he didn't even do any due diligence. He didn't even do any homework. So people are so quick to attack and want to take down, as we hear in the woke mob, a term I was never familiar with at all. And I just think it's sad, because one of the reasons that I actually even apologized for not doing anything at all was because I was told that ESPN was going to do their proper due diligence. And if there's any due diligence done with regards to what happened to me, and I'm just a small little guy, but the due diligence would have been, well, in 1995, Nike's biggest tennis ad campaign ever to this day was called Guerrilla Tennis, Guerrilla. And it was with Andre Agassi and Pete Sampras, and everybody in the entire world saw this advert.
They set up a tennis match in the street in 1995. It became this meme, and even it was revisited in the 2000s, I believe, wasn't it? Or 2015 even.
2015, they did a celebration of that ad with Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Serena Williams, Lindsay Davenport, you name it, Nick Kyrgios, everybody of all race, culture, ethnicity, of greatness in tennis. They were all there celebrating that ad. And the interesting thing was, back in 95 and for many years therefrom, coaches around the country, coaches around the world were teaching kids guerrilla tennis.
Which basically means rush the net. Is that what it translated? I'm not good at tennis, so tell us.
Yeah, it's pretty much get your butt to the net so you can end the point. And back then, the game of tennis was all about getting to the net as quickly as possible, even surprising your opponent, hitting a volley, and ending the point. And if kids weren't willing to do that, the coaches would say, well, this is how you play tennis. This is how you're going to play tennis. Nowadays, it really becomes the gorilla factor or the gorilla effect, because most players stay and hang on the baseline today.
Right,
Very
they're dropping it back and forth. These
right.
rallies.
So actually, when someone does come forward to the net today, it really is a surprise attack. Therefore, gorilla effect, gorilla tennis. Yeah.
Well, let's talk, if we can, about the instant reaction, because one wonders whether the reporter himself, who suddenly saw that, and by the way, when I was a reporter for the Journal, and you had to file to the news wire service, the ticker. Okay, if you're at a news conference on earnings, you run to the payphone back in that day. Yeah, payphone, and you call up. But before you ever did anything, you had to go check it first. You never put anything on the wire instantly without getting confirmation. So you said 15% expected earnings growth, right? I just need to make sure of that. You never went without checking. This guy does that. It then goes everywhere. But the problem is, yeah, he blew that. And one wonders if he heard a racist term because he felt racist or feared he was racist. But then what bothers me about your story, Doug Adler, ex-ESPN, is that everyone then utterly abandons you. I mean, the producer that you work with and trust, he did a good job. He tried to help you come up with the right apology before, just to cauterize the wound and get beyond it. But then everyone abandoned you. They fired you. Then you have this heart attack. No one sent you flowers in the hospital. Did I get that right?
I didn't get any flowers. I actually think they wanted me dead. But there's a couple of issues here. The guy that did the tweet had like 70,000 followers, right? So this was a way of him being a, quote, social justice warrior to alert the troops, ignite the fire, and take a bunch of credit as the guy throwing the first punch, because there was no retaliation.
Yes. I looked at this guy. Do we want to mention his name or not? I looked at his tweets back to that era. And even 2 days later, he was not saying, look, I should have checked, or maybe, oh, gee, I don't know. Instead, he was saying, look, I'd heard a couple years before someone else used that term for Serena, gorilla, and it just made my skin crawl. He's just so noble. And that is what social media about. It's what I call, Doug, shopping for umbrage, okay? Or getting out in front and crusading and calling out things. And then it reminds me of grade school when one kid in class would be picked out and then everyone went after him. And that's what they kind of did to you. But it also shows, doesn't it, fear inside ESPN of some type of fallout. And we forget that even the biggest, most monolithic companies are made up of people, and they just want to hold on to their job and they just want to avoid controversy.
Yeah, well, that's called being a coward. But this guy was basically a stringer, freelancer at best for the New York Times. Did the New York Times, the paper of truth, the paper of fact, step in and say anything or address it? Never. This guy suffered no retribution, because the problem with social media and the way that it's set up is amateurs, because he didn't know anything about tennis. The only thing he knew is that he'd had a problem with both Serena and Venus Williams, the Williams sisters, a few years prior, because he had body shamed Serena, and he was looking to get back into their good graces.
That's so interesting. So much of what goes on there is about a personal motive. And then afterward, though, especially when they realized, oh my gosh, we've made a horrible mistake, because this young reporter, shall I mention the name? Is it?
You can mention his name.
It's Ben Rothenberg. He's still there. I just checked. He had a story just in January 2022. This young reporter had never heard the guerrilla warfare allusion to tennis style, which means he wasn't even old enough for when the ad first ran in 1995 to recall it, if he had even been a tennis fan. But he brings all this, but then I also fault ESPN for how it reacted. And by the way, what we see from your case in January 2017 is an early peek at the very same woke culture that overtook ESPN and Disney. They were having, on-air people who were super liberal, super radical, saying ridiculous things. Here's the thing. I just last night watched this Chris Rock special, and he talks about selective outrage, when they decide to be upset. They got upset about you and fired you really for bad reasons or no reason. But then you have what's his name, RGB the third. To tell us about that.
Robert Griffin III,
The former
quarterback for the Washington Redskins, has been out of the game for a while, and just a couple months ago during the NFL season, he was sitting at halftime with a group of ESPN folks talking about how everybody was wrong about how they had
on air.
The errors they'd made about Jalen Hurts, the quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles. This is before the Eagles reached the Super Bowl. And while he was explaining, what people were so wrong about in judging Jalen Hurts, he then got to the end of his tirade and said,
people said that Jalen Hurts couldn't get it done. He couldn't operate from the pocket. He's not the quarterback of the future. I think he proved all those jigaboos wrong. Now,
I was brought up that you don't say that, and no one says it, regardless of color.
Right.
It's just something you don't say. It's like calling a Jewish person a kike. I mean, it's not a good thing. And what were the repercussions to Robert Griffin for what he said? Well, he said that's not what he meant to say. He made up something, and nothing happened.
Right. And part of this is because he's frankly a person of color. He's African-American, whereas a white person is not granted the same latitude. There's almost a guilty before proven innocent assumption. And I think what happened to you, Doug, I don't know if you realize this, but I think it's happening in very small, miniature ways in the workplace. I know of a friend. They come in, this is before COVID, with a bit of a cold a couple of years ago. And an Asian woman says, "Oh, would you like some tea? I have some hot tea right here." And my friend says, "Oh, is it Chinese?" The Asian woman files a complaint as a microaggression when really the friend meant, "Hey, man, I love some Chinese tea, especially because that's healing." And so it's totally misinterpreted. And yet the company didn't have the stones to come out and say, "We're sorry you've misinterpreted this." Instead, they send the person to training because it's a white person.
Well, there's no doubt, Dennis, a double standard going on, and it's been going on for obviously since my incident. You can call it hypocrisy, you can call it double standard. I have quite a few African American friends, and we discussed the Robert Griffin III situation, and they were appalled. And even if you want to take it one step further, since we're being candid, when Will Smith walked up to that stage and hit or slapped Chris Rock at the Academy Awards, if a white person had done that, there would have been outrage. That's called assault and battery. And that person would have been pulled off the stage by guards, by security,
arrested.
The whole group of people in that audience would have been going crazy in a frenzy, and that guy would have been pulled off to jail immediately.
Yes. And it would have been seen purely through only a racist lens. That's it, because it would be white and black. At the time, I thought about that and was thankful that at least it was black on black.
Well, Chris Rock addressed that in his Netflix special. You know, people were asking him, "Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you do anything in response?" He said, "Because my parents were there." He said, "My parents were there. My parents taught me, don't fight another black man in front of white people." It was really interesting.
But at the same time, he points out that, look, Will Smith played Ali. Okay, I played Pookie.
Well, Will Smith's a big man.
He's a big man. And Will Smith, would he have done that if it were Aquaman? Have you seen that dude's, guns? Would he have done it if the Aquaman made that joke? I kind of doubted that. And it bothered me that Will Smith did get away with it. You make a very good point about that. Another thing about words and the power of words and slipping with jigaboo and the N word. And let's remember, there's a guy that used to work at the Wall Street Journal when I was a reporter there, or maybe after that. And he got fired inside as a senior VP at Netflix because they were in a meeting talking about how we're going to handle this N-word thing with movies like, Quentin Tarantino. And he kept saying the word out, the full word, and, not noticing that people are drawing, and they fired him for this, basically. We're so sensitive about it. Yet Chris Rock is dropping the N-bomb with a nice little friendly A on the end rather than the ER, okay? 20, 30 times in this special. and it's okay.
Double standard. We're living in a strange time. I don't hold it against anybody, actually. I only can talk about what I've learned and common sense. And the bottom line is, had ESPN, had they done the right thing, which was their due diligence, and if my name were John McEnroe, we wouldn't be having this discussion, Dennis. This is a non-issue. But I was expendable. I was a little guy, and I was collateral damage for what was going on in the country at that time. It was just bad timing. And the other thing, you made one comment that Ben Rothenberg wasn't old enough to know about what I said. But the reality and the truth behind that is Ben Rothenberg has been doing a podcast for several years. And he's worked with a woman by the name of Courtney Wynn, who covers tennis. And back in 2012, 2013, 2014, prior to my situation, she wrote about guerrilla tactics, guerrilla warfare, covering women's tennis. He had to know, he had to discuss it with her in some way, shape, or form, either prior to his going after me or after, because there were lots of tweets and lots of emails sent that would have made him very aware of it.
Did you uncover any of that communication between them in your lawsuit against ESPN that led to a settlement pretty much in your favor?
Oh, yeah, it was all a big part of it. Sure. It was all a big part of it. But to me, Dennis, the settlement wasn't the significant thing. Money is, sure, it's very important. And I had lost out on a lot of money. But more important than that, big corporations, as you know, they don't apologize. So when people say you got to get them to apologize, I was saying it's not going to happen. But to me, the second best thing was getting a 1-year employment contract with ESPN, putting me back on the air. What more could I ask for in terms of vindication if they're putting a known racist back on their airwaves?
Hang on. Before we get there, and I do want to go there, Doug Adler, ex-ESPN, I want to point out that only today, my producer's going to jeer at this because I credit the Wall Street Journal too much. Only today, there's an op-ed in the Journal that says a study by 2 academics has concluded that a lot of the woke fallout and people who are losing their jobs is driven by the next level of employees who are younger and super woke. And it's not just because they want it for their political ideology. They want to move people out of the way so that they can step up on the career ladder, that it is ulterior motives and job considerations that really are driving a lot of that. That's a shocking thing that ran just in the Wall Street Journal this week, as a matter of fact.
I concur with it. Sorry, your producer is going to be disappointed, but certainly I relate to that. And, listen, Dennis, time moves on. We try to put the bad behind us because life is short and you got to make the most of it. Yes. So when you have something like this, that's career ending, almost life ending, I had, a heart attack one month after the firing. The firing took place one day before my birthday, one day before the Trump inauguration. And then I had open heart surgery. I just feel like the good side to this story is I survived. I fought for what was right and I survived. But the real takeaway, Dennis, the real takeaway is we're 6 years later and people are going, well, why is this even an issue 6 years later? I mean, this is a long time ago, but it hasn't gotten better. And I had a situation happen to me just last summer where I was up for a big job. Would have been my first big job live at an event in Washington, D.C., coming back to the City Open, where I worked in the past with kids from the Washington Tennis and Education Foundation that were coming out of, the community and such that didn't have much money. And they would come and I would coach them prior to going to work. Well, I was offered this job, which in the past, if someone offered me a job and I said, awesome, give it, I'd love it. The airplane tickets come in the next day. Well, with this job, I got a phone call the next day that said the Citigroup board said no to your comeback tour toward you coming back and being an event that we loved you at. They said no because you are too controversial a figure. This is 5.5 years later when I've been vindicated. And not only
this is just a lack of courage and just willing to just damn anyone that's been damned by the mob and unwilling to stand up and take the other side and say, wait a minute, even
no guts to do the right thing, right?
Yes.
So just like ESPN 5.5 years prior was unwilling to do the right thing because they just didn't care. They just didn't care. And their audience was far more important to, if anyone said anything, than Doug Adler and doing right by me. Citigroup is doing the exact same thing, but actually worse, because they're saying, the ambulance is coming to take me away right now. They're saying that I'm too controversial, which is BS, and no one's going to care. And if anyone were to say anything, they could certainly say, he's vindicated. He's a good guy. He didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah. There's not even a Wikipedia entry on this thing. Okay, no. It has been forgotten.
And the last thing is, my conversation with my producer ends with, and by the way, Doug, don't expect to ever work in the broadcast business ever again. Now, that was a real rude awakening to a guy who had a lot of hope, even 5.5 years later.
Yeah.
And that was the impetus for me to say, okay, what am I going to do about this? Am I going to just close my eyes and go to the park and walk by myself every day? Or am I going to try to make people aware so they see what's really going on with big corporations? And so they're aware it could happen to them too. And I have to be the person that sends the right message for the right reasons.
Right.
And that was the purpose of trying to start the book.
Yeah. Well, I think you're on a good path here, Doug Adler. And let me point out, guys, he's not some big conservative. Okay. The woke went after one of their own. I mean, the man has never voted for a Republican in his life here. And it shows you that once that woke mob gets going, they will take out anyone. It doesn't even matter who they are or what they've done. I mean, it serves their purposes. And then corporate America lacks the courage to stand up to it. And I'm hoping that'll change. So stay out there and keep going, and best of luck to you.
Well, thank you, Dennis. I mean, it's programs like this that help me send a message that I want to send and share. And the best thing that can happen is making as many people aware of it so they understand how many things can go wrong for no reason. And then they themselves, maybe that helps to turn it. Maybe that helps to make things better for other people.
Anytime we come under attack from a whole crowd over something, it says a lot more about the attackers and what's inside them than it does about the person they're attacking. And I think that's showing up here.
Well, they're the ones with the real hate and rage in their heart.
Exactly.
And the other thing is, the last thing I'm going to say is, I was brought up by my parents to accept that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. And that certainly has no realm at all of factuality going on today.
They've been given words too much power, and it's because the people themselves are too weak. All right. Have a glorious day. Thank you so much for being with us, Doug Adler. We appreciate hearing your story. Okay.
I appreciate your interest and your support, and continued success with your podcast.
All right, man. Great. We'll see you soon. Take care.